This lecture is a recording that reviews Robert B. Marx's Chapter 1 in The Origins of the Modern World. The chapter is titled The Material and Trading Worlds, circa 1400. So Marx starts out by talking about political, social, and cultural structures, and we should talk about what those are. Structures are patterned arrangements that govern interactions in human history. Social structures are patterned arrangements that govern social interaction. Political structures are patterned arrangements that govern political interaction, etc. So you can imagine there are more than just social, political, and cultural structures. There are economic structures, theological structures, ideological structures, structures that create the basic rules by which we work and go through our daily lives on a minute-to-minute basis and on a year-to-year basis across large cultures and down to the individual. Structures work at macro, meso, and micro levels. A macro structure is something that covers an entire society or even more, such as the overall political system, which is a political structure, or the class relations within a society, which is a social structure. A mesostructure would be a structure that has to do with the relations between individuals and organizations or political parties and their memberships. It is at the medium level. A microstructure would have to do with relations between individuals and other individuals. For example, the way that individuals relate to other individuals within their religious system, within their church, within their political party, on an individual basis. As you can see, structures are large in terms of social investment, and so they change only very slowly over long periods of time. In fact, it might be useful to think of structures in the sort of literal way as a building or a road or something like that. And if we think of structures in that way, then a macro structure might be something like the overall plan of a city or the overall logistical transportation system that we use. All of those roads, all of the electrical lines, all of the sewer systems, all of those systems by which we move around and understand the physical part of our society. And it's obvious then that at the macro level especially, that system of roads and transportation would be very difficult to make major changes to. But of course, small changes happen over time, and over time, those small changes build on each other to make much greater changes. So a mesostructure, in that sort of literal sense, would be something like perhaps a set of government buildings or one government building in which certain things happen, and that building then might be built out or reduced in size, or the purposes of its rooms changed, or its ability, for example, to connect to the internet changed. Still, a large government building or a large corporate building is a place where many individuals go to work, and the changes that happen with that involve large and small changes over time, but they are not easy and they're expensive. At the micro level then, a structure might be your house or your condominium or your apartment. That is a place where individuals relate to other individuals. It's much smaller. It is less expensive for us to make minor and major changes to those structures. So at a geographical or a physical level, those would be the kinds of structures we're talking about. So when we talk about political, cultural, or social structures, we're really only talking about an idea of structures that operate in different realms of existence. So what structures existed in 1400? According to Marx, there are many structures in society, and we could probably name them all day. But in this course, we can't talk about all of them or we'd be here forever. So Marx is interested in only two structures. He's interested in the fact that agriculture was the primary way in which all economic activity occurred. He calls this the material conditions of life. And this is obviously an essentially economic macro structure. Marx calls it the biological old regime. Since regime means the way things work across a whole society, in a sense what he's saying is that the economic structure of the world in 1400 was almost entirely biological, based on agriculture. All of our goods, etc., came from biological means, and he refers to the transformation of the energy of the sun into biological energy, which we'll get into a little bit later, but that comes from farming. He also wants to talk about trading networks. that connected most of the old world. What he's talking about is the world not including the Americas, Australia, and parts of Oceania, which certainly had structures themselves, but were not yet connected to the Eurasian continent where the majority of the population existed in 1400. And that, of course, is going to change in this course as well. That's one of the changes we'll look at. So this is another economic macrostructure, that is the trade structure of the world in 1400, and he wants to start with those for several reasons. So in many ways we can see that Marx is giving us an economic history of the world, or at least his history of the world is grounded in an economic view of history. So he wants to start by talking about the biological old regime. And as I said, a regime is a system, or the way things work. So the biological old regime is the relations and material processes by which all humans lived before the Industrial Revolution. And Marx's main point here is that all food, material goods, and energy came from natural processes, primarily farming in 1400. Now that's not to discount mining, it's not to discount the use of hunting or gathering, or even the cutting down of trees, etc., for construction purposes. But if you think about all of those, they are all essentially what Marx is talking about. That is to say, hunting and gathering is the collection of plants and animals that gained their energy from the same sources as farming. It's just that they grew up in a more natural, that is to say, non-human or less human influenced system. Mining is a similar way of gaining material goods that were processed through natural systems, that is to say, again, metal ores and that sort of thing, came through the formation of the earth, and probably also from comets, that is, I guess, meteors. Can't remember the difference between the two, but that arrived on Earth and spread their metallic components into the soil. The processes of, well, what we're seeing on the Big Island today, eruption, and all kinds of other geological processes that created all of the kinds of things that we mine from the earth, including energy materials like coal and that sort of thing. But those things were not used very much for energy in the era of 1400. So really everything came from natural processes, and mining was simply a means of extracting them. But mining also used natural processes, that is human muscle and animal muscle, rather than other kinds of energy to move earth and to get to the elements that were necessary. So this is the biological old regime. Marx also goes into the idea that he calls the weight of numbers. That is to say, he wants to think about population and the distribution of population in the world today and the world in 1400 in order to make a couple of key comparisons, which we'll get to in a minute. I just wanted to throw up this chart to show you the key difference. Sometimes it helps to look in a graphic sense. So in blue on the left here is the world population in 1400. That was about 380 million people. And in orange on the right, the large bar, is the world population today, about 7.3 billion people. And the story of the transformation of the world, and that is, of course, the story of human history, is also in part the story of this population growth, how it was possible, especially given the constraints of the biological old regime, to feed people and to create the necessary conditions to feed so many people in such a small place. And he also gives a comparison just to make us realize what a big difference this is on a global scale. If you compare the far right small bar, that is the population of North America at about 310 million people today, to the world population bar in orange just to the left of it, you'll see that and to the world population bar from 1400, you'll see that the population of North America, that's mostly the United States and Canada, matches roughly the world population of 1400. And so if you populated the entire world only with the people who now live in the United States and Canada, you can imagine how much smaller our cities would be, how much less impact we would have on the environment, just in terms of how much less farmland would be necessary, how much fewer toilets, for example, would be necessary, how much less electricity we would need. All of this then is just by way of comparison in terms of the amount of population load that is on the planet. And as Marx wants us to know, the story of human history is the story of breaking the limits of the biological old regime so that we can support such a huge population. And he also wants us to recognize, this is a population graph from 900 to 1900. He wants us to recognize that human population has not always been on a growth curve like it has been since 1700. In fact, Marx wants to make it really clear that while human population has always grown at a slow but steady rate, in fact, you can see here, it has grown and then declined in a series of great wave patterns that occurred over several centuries. And the key point here is just to make a big notice of 1700, where the population curve turns up and has not yet turned downward and is not predicted by population scientists or biologists to turn downward in the next 50 years. So human population is experiencing a different situation now than it has for its entire history. And that's something to be aware of as we go through the rest of the course. So this is a population trend since 1700 AD, and you can see that there are no great waves in this. First of all, the growth trend from 1700 to 1900 is a relatively straight line that moves upward. Then you can see the growth curve from 1900 until the projected population of 2050 at about 9.3 billion is an extremely steep population growth line, and we're of course in 2018, so already rather than 6.05 billion, we're at 7.3 billion. Our population is doubling very, very quickly these days. In fact, our population is doubling far faster than it was in the period of 1400. So population is growing quickly. There doesn't seem to be a check on it, and Marx wants us to think about this and recognize that that probably comes because we have found ways around the limits of the biological old regime. So population density in civilizations. I do have to apologize. I wasn't very good at making this map. Something about the technology didn't work well for me. It still conveys the general idea. You can see that the largest population centers in the world and the densest ones are all in these places with light blue to dark blue shading. And of course, China with 125 million in 1400 was the largest population center with the most density, although I do have to tell you that the technology really only allowed me to make population figures for states as they are organized and bordered today. So that 125 million actually lived much closer to the coast of the Pacific Ocean than it looks like in this map, because this is a modern map. Japan was also large, and for some reason Japan doesn't get a blue shading here, or if it does, I'm unable to see it. Korea, Indonesia, India, most of Southeast Asia. These were the biggest population centers in the earth, in the world, followed then by Europe, and I've only been able to put blue shading in Spain for some reason, but really Europe includes England, which had about 2 million people, Spain, which had about 3 million people, Poland and Lithuania combined had about 7 million people. France and Germany combined had about 7 million people, and Italy had about 2 million people. So altogether, Europe probably had about 18 million people. And then you can see in the Americas, the Aztec Empire in Mexico, about 6 million people, and the Inca Empire in what we call Peru today, which had about 11 million people. So these are the major population centers in 1400. And Marx wants you to know that it is the same places in the world where the largest populations exist today. That is to say, about 80 to 90% of the human population still lives in the same 7% of arable agricultural land territory that we lived in 1400. So there is much more population density today but there is not much wider spread of population today globally than there was in 1400. In other words, we're just putting a heck of a lot more people in the same places, and those places are the areas that have always been good for agriculture. Uh, just to show you, this video is about population density and civilization. It's worth taking a quick look at because it shows the cities of the world, and I find it fascinating. The top 5 cities in the world are not always in the same place, but they are always in the same places. That is to say, like Mark says, on the specific territories where the largest populations have always existed in good agricultural land, that top 7% of the total global surface. So what's the key to understanding all of this? Well, according to Marx, the agricultural revolution is the real revolution in human history. And that, he says, is very difficult to understand because it is not a revolution that happened suddenly. It took centuries, actually thousands of years, until people began farming. This wasn't because they didn't know how, although that may be true initially. People figured out how farming worked quite easily, but they didn't begin farming until climate change forced certain populations in certain areas to begin to grow their own food. Once they began to grow their own food, successful agriculture led to population increases. Population increases were used to increase labor, and that was used to increase the intensity of farming on the good land that was used for farming. As this happened, one of the key social structures began to show up, and that is the political structure of human society. Now, of course, political structure has changed dramatically, but one of the things that Marx wants to make clear is that agriculture made it possible for humans to create a surplus. That is to say, we could make more food than we could actually eat, and that surplus was used for a couple of different things. It was used for trade, in order to get other goods that other people made, gathered, or grew. And it was used for taxation in order to allow certain members of society to do work that was not directly related to feeding the population. And then it was used to buy weapons, feed and house armies, and to encourage people who made technology to continue to do so without having to worry about feeding themselves. So this agricultural surplus is the key to political and social organization of humans. So again, we have this 5 top cities in the world, and it's a very interesting video. I recommend that you take a few minutes to watch. It's only about 5 minutes long. It goes from 3000 to about 1600 AD. 3000 BC to 1600 AD. Another group of people that Marx wants to mention in this chapter that we need to be aware of, and who are also reacting to the biological old regime, were the nomadic pastoralists, and that includes people that we call the Mongols, although early on in history, in the territory that we talk about as Mongolia, these people were called the Xiongnu, but you have Scythians, the Xiongnu, many different groups of nomadic pastoralists who herded animals, and those animals again gathered the energy of the sun, as Marx says, from grazing on the massive grasslands in the northern part of the Eurasian continent. Those animals became food. They also became the source of transportation. They became the system for hunting and eventually for warfare that was used by these pastoralists, and also became a means for trade and an inroad into connections with the civilizations. So the nomadic pastoralists both spread ideas across this great steppe, and they also traded, and they also spread ideas through military conquest, and so they are an intimate part of the changes that occurred through the modern world. We also need to think about the inverse relationship between human populations and wildlife. And this is interesting to Marx because primarily it kind of confirms his ideas about the rise of the modern world and how it is intimately related to nature and the environment. Marx's main point in this is that basically wherever we go in the world, when human populations rise, that means there's a greater need for agricultural land. As agricultural land is cleared and used for farming or for housing, that also increases the use of natural resources and the destruction of natural forest land or natural environments that animals were using, and that tends to lead to the decline of various different animal species in local areas. Marx is not being critical of this. He's just saying that essentially we have to be aware of the fact that what's going on here is that as human populations increase, local animal populations tend to decrease. And that means that humans are dependent on the environment, but it also means that the environment is dependent on human activity. So there is a give and take that goes on here. Marx also finds it interesting that during population declines in human societies, for example, the Black Plague in 13th century Europe, you find corresponding increases in local animal species. So there is an inverse relationship here that really confirms the connection of humans to the environment. This is also true when it comes to land. Humans use land for agriculture, for housing, for cities, for trade, all kinds of things. And population increase leads to the opening up of new land for growing food, which leads to an increased level of use intensiveness. That means that when we have more people, we have to feed those people, and there are two choices. Either we open up more land to grow food on, or if we don't open up more land, we use the land that we have much more intensively by trying to increase yields. And we do this either by increasing labor or by increasing the amount of food that is planted or grown, or by finding technological means to grow more food on that same property. So the point here is that, again, human population is to some degree dependent on the environment in the biological old regime. That would mean that if population grew too fast, then land use strategies, either intensive agriculture or increasing the land under cultivation, could fail, and that leads to famine and population decline. And we see that in many societies across history. So in general, what Marx wants us to see is that famine, disease, war, and disasters meant that human life was generally shorter, not always, but generally shorter in the period in which the biological old regime was the only system by which humans gained the energy to survive than it is today. Because we've overcome, in many ways, the limits of the biological old regime, we've also overcome natural limits on age and on mortality. Famine is a common occurrence in human history. In a world in which everything is gained by farming, 80% to 90% of people in any given society were farmers. Most used about 50% of their produce to pay rent to local elites and taxes to more distant elites who did not farm. So farmers' job was not just to feed themselves and their society, but also to produce a surplus that supported the leaders of their society. Those elites most frequently did not reduce rents and taxes when harvests were bad. This is not to say that those elites were not good people or were evil, although certainly in some cases that was true. But it is to say that often the response to famine was either limited because famine came unpredictably, and it was often a result of poor weather, or in cases where societies were at war, elites chose to continue the war, and the cost of that war, including feeding armies and the consequent destruction of farmland where armies fought, then over finding ways to improve harvests. And transportation was extremely slow and extremely expensive, so finding ways to move large amounts of food where there was still a surplus to places where there wasn't a surplus was extremely difficult. So essentially, although famine occurred often because of natural and sometimes because of human failings, that is to say war or the overuse of agricultural land or the failure or lack of ability to open up new agricultural land, Famine was also often not natural, but a social phenomenon. It was created by the system of leadership and the ability of a society to react or not react to natural and human-made problems. So this then was a result of social structures that couldn't react to fit changing needs fast enough. So this is one of the limits of the biological old regime. One of the other key limits to the biological old regime, at least initially, was entirely natural, and that has to do with the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is one of two ingredients in what Marx calls the somatic energy regime. This comes from the words that we use in biology and medicine to describe the neural and movement system of muscles, and it means essentially that all energy came, or most energy came, from human and animal muscle. If it didn't come from human and animal muscle, that energy came from reining in the power of natural energy sources like wind and water. Nitrogen is key in this situation because nitrogen is one of the most important parts of chlorophyll, which helps plants convert energy from the sun into carbohydrates, which is then used by plants for energy. It's used by the animals and people that eat plants for energy, and it's used, of course, by people who eat the animals who eat plants for energy. So nitrogen is a key part of the somatic energy regime, and nitrogen creates a kind of natural limit on the populations of plants, animals, and humans in the natural world. And this is because most nitrogen is inert in the air. That is to say, it cannot be easily converted into nitrogen by breaking the bonds between nitrogen and other atmospheric gases. So the most common way for us to get nitrogen is to get it in the soil. Plants need nitrogen to create their chlorophyll, etc. And in the natural worlds, when humans and animals consume plants and when we consume other animals, in the process of digestion we excrete nitrogen molecules that can then be used by plants again in the soil. So this is called the nitrogen cycle, which you can see on the right here. Without that nitrogen cycle, we have no nitrogen, which creates chlorophyll, so we have no plants to create energy to use for farming. So in the biological old regime, this nitrogen cycle limited population because it is chemically extremely difficult to create unbonded nitrogen in other ways. There are also other problems with the biological old regime. Marx mentioned that there were elites who took rents and taxes but didn't produce any food, and they may have produced other things of value in society, but they didn't contribute to the somatic energy regime. So on one level, we can think of those people as what Marx calls macro-parasites, that is to say, large-size parasites. But disease is a micro-parasite that also caused humans biological problems and death. Like famine, disease was often a social phenomenon. Although microparasites were natural organisms, they thrived in the close-quartered populations of growing towns and cities, and they spread over large areas through human trade, through trade practices, and through war. And initially, most human diseases came from human agricultural practices, primarily living in close proximity to animals who were also susceptible to biological disease, and those diseases would eventually transfer to human populations. So in many ways, disease is also a social phenomenon. And then Marx brings us to sort of the crux of his entire chapter theory here. That is to say that we tend to think of the world in 1400 as being a set of disconnected societies, but that's not actually the fact. The way things worked in 1400 was that world trade was connected not through a single trading network. It doesn't look like globalization looks today, but there were 8 interregional, interlinking trade zones in Eurasia, and those trade zones, which you can see in the picture to the left here, constituted a world trade system without a single center, although they certainly had primary or central trading cities within them. So you can see, for example, at the top in Trade Zone 3, there are two centers of Trade Zone 3. There's Constantinople, which is actually part of Trade Zone 2, but very close to the interlinking lines of Trade Zone 3. And Trade Zone 3 is based in Beijing or Peking, but Bukhara and Samarkand are also key trading posts, as is Tabriz. And then that trade zone is interlinked with Trade Zone 2 and Trade Zone 4, which is the Middle East, centered on Baghdad and Basra. You can see an African trade zone. You can see the European trade zone centered on Troyes and Bruges and Genoa in the far left. And then you can see the Indian Ocean, where we have a trade zone 7 and Trade Zone 6 interlinking with each other. So each zone had its own center and was connected at its periphery with one or two other trade zones, and this facilitated trade between all of these zones. So humans were trading with each other. Although movement and trade was expensive, it certainly was happening, and it was one vector for spreading both wealth and food, but also disease and warfare. So in order to put all this together, Marx gives us an example, the Black Death. He calls it a mid-14th century conjuncture, and if you remember your introduction, Marx talks about accident, conjuncture, and contingencies in history. Contingencies are events that occur because other events happened that made them possible, that led to them. Accidents are events that happen simply because of accident, because things occur the way they do in nature, or because of coincidence or that sort of thing. And then conjuncture is a much larger group of events that tend to happen together. They can be a combination of accident and contingencies and even other conjunctures, but they combine at one time to make a large series of events and major change. So Marx wants to tell us that the Black Death is an example of historical conjuncture. And in order to do so, he gives us a series of contingencies and accidents. So he tells us that the Black Death originated in the Tibetan Qinghai Plateau, which is quite a ways from Europe, and that initially it probably went to China first from the Tibetan Plateau, brought to China through the vector, the movement of invading Mongol troops, who probably either carried it in their supplies, or maybe fleas on their person, or rats in their saddlebags, or various ways that it might have moved. And certainly some of them probably caught the plague and brought it with them to China as they invaded China in the 1200s. Then how did it get west? And we think it may have spread westward to Europe through, again, Mongol invading armies moving westward, but also through trade routes to Europe across the Eurasian continent, also often known as the Silk Road, and ships trading across the Indian Ocean. So the existence of all these things, the Mongol soldiers, the trade routes across the Silk Road, and the ships across the Indian Ocean, are all necessary in order for the spread of the Black Plague. That means the Black Plague is contingent on them. So we already have a three-step process. The next step, Europe was already perfectly prepared for this to happen. So Europe was already a perfect host. For various reasons, probably increase in population and the density of cities, the fact that cities were walled, the fact that Europe had very little idea of public health at the time, a number of reasons. Black rats had increased in population in Europe by about the same time that these three other vectors were beginning to bring the Black Plague toward Europe. So this probably means that European urbanization and increase in population made it a prime spot for the thriving of rats, which carried the fleas, which carried the disease. Whatever the case, because of increased European population in 13, facing unusually cold winters, which was a historical accident, of course, this meant shorter growing seasons, and that meant a lack of food for what was already a very large population facing the limits of the biological old regime. So we have an increase of rats, which carry the fleas, which carry the disease, probably because of the lack of understanding in Europe of cleanliness and health issues. We have a large population that is starving to death because of unusually cold winters and short growing seasons, and all of this led to weakened bodies from lack of food, which led to weakened immune systems, and that allowed the disease to be spread more easily amongst large numbers of the people. And so you have about a 40 to 60% death rate in Europe, and because the disease caught on so easily there, it spread quickly to North Africa and to Central Asia and Northern Europe. So the plague was not a completely natural event. It was a conjuncture, a combination of accident and contingencies on human structures and activities as well. Altogether then, what Marx wants us to understand is that the way the humans lived in 1400 was dependent upon farming, which was dependent upon nitrogen, land, labor, and sufficient food. And it was dependent upon trade, which was dependent upon products from farming, technology, mostly in terms of transportation, and surplus, that is to say people who did not have to farm and were then able to create new technologies or come up with new systems of government or be traders that helped move other goods across the globe. So this is the biological old regime, a set of relationships that existed in order to help people live in the period before the Industrial Revolution, in this case particularly 1400 AD.